Hello, how are you? Hope you're very well. Nice flick of the hair there. My weekly weather watch. It's been raining, but it's seeming to dry up, and it's quite bright. Oh, hello. We're gonna continue today. Hi, Anne. We're going to continue today with our watch through the 12 minor prophets, and we'll wait a minute or two. But we're going to continue with Habakuck today, and Habakuck's a really interesting guy. He's hiya John. Habakuck is quite an arsey guy. Good morning. He's got this real attitude that God isn't doing things right. Hi, John. There's two Johns watching. John Colley and John Derry. But Habakkuk has a real propensity for argument. So he's a guy who really loves God, but he doesn't understand him in the slightest, and he's constantly arguing with him. If it's not a matter of, well, you're being too harsh, well, you're being too soft, and it's one or the other. Well, let's get going. Habakkuk comes 20 years after Zephaniah, and we covered Zephaniah last week, and his name means someone who hugs. If you ever watched MASH, there was a guy on MASH called Klinger, and that's what Habakkuk's name means. Klinger. Clings to you. I can't see the end of your comment, John, so I'll read it afterwards. So Habakkuk was a man who clung to God, who dared to argue with God, who insisted on getting answers from God, but he didn't like the answers that he got. So that's why I said he's got a propensity for argument. He's constantly arguing. We're dealing with contradiction between facts and faith. Sometimes what we believe doesn't look like the truth because the facts seem to be against us. If God is good and all-powerful, why did the innocent... Hi, Anthony. Why did the innocent suffer and the guilty not suffer? And that was the essence of Habakkuk's argument. He couldn't get his head around it. Why doesn't God act more quickly, and why doesn't God do something about the mess that the world is in? And that sounds like 90% of the prayers that go up these days. The best way to answer these questions is to wrestle with God, rather than wrestling with the issues on your own or with other people. and to cling to him until he gives you an answer. And that's what Habakkuk did. His boldness and sheer honesty came through in this little prophecy, and it is a little prophecy. It's only 3 chapters, and yet it's full to bursting with all sorts of things. Habakkuk is full of quotable things to say, unlike Zephaniah. Zephaniah was not full of things to say, and Habakkuk, there's some of the things that he says. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. What a fantastic verse. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silent before him. In wrath, remember mercy. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vine, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, and be joyful in God my Saviour. But the most famous is this really short statement. The just shall live by faith. And Martin Luther had that verse, not to be confused with Martin Luther King, but Martin Luther. My stick is wandering around, probably because I'm banging the table, because I'm getting excited. Why do the innocent always seem to suffer? Well, we'll maybe get to that. Martin Luther, in about the 16th century, made this one verse, the just shall live by faith, ring around Northern Europe, and it became the mainstay of the Reformation. But it was misunderstood and misinterpreted, what it actually means, and we'll come to that a little later. Now to the structure of Habakkuk. The contrast between Habakkuk is more or less split into 2 halves. The first and second chapter is one half, and the third chapter is another half. And the contrast between the 2 halves couldn't be more different. In chapter 1 to 2, in the first half of Habakkuk, he's wrestling with God, he's battling with God. And in chapter 3, he's resting in God, he's at peace with God. In the first half, he's miserable. In the second half, he's happy. In the first half, he's shouting at God. In the second half, he's singing to God. The first half is full of prayer, and the second half is full of praise. The first half, he's impatient for God to do something. In the second half, he's patient. I will wait for the Lord. He asks for justice in the first half, and he asks for mercy in the second half. And he's down in the dumps in the first half, and he's on a high in the second half. Something in between the two the 2 halves, in between chapter 1 to 2 and chapter 3, pretty big must have happened, because he's a changed man in chapter 3. So let's look at what happened. The outline of the book is he starts with a complaining prayer. If ever a man complained to God, it was Habakkuk. And he was honest about his complaints. And he told God exactly what he was thinking. Sheer honesty in prayer. And the first part in chapter 1, verse 2 to 11, he's stating that God does too little. And in chapter 1, verse 12 to 2 and verse 20, he's on about God does too much. So God can't win either way. And we are very much similar to this. Hi, Elaine or Clive, whichever you are. Some folks just, we're talking about Habakkuk. Some folks just, you just can't please. He even switches from one to another during the argument. Habakkuk's real problem was that he expected God to fit into what we are doing and not we fit into what God is doing. The second section, it actually says that this is set to music, and it's composed praise. It says that this is music, and he wants it. Hi, Elaine. I'm never quite sure whether it's Elaine or Clive. Main times it's Elaine. But the second half, chapter 3 of Habakkuk, is supposed to be set to stringed instruments. Very specific, very much a matter of prophecy, and lots of prophecy. Prophecy is combined quite often with music and musicians and praise. So get into grips with the heart of this prophecy. Habakkuk believes in a form of interrogatory prayer, where you're asking God a question. Intercessory prayer we've all heard of, which is when you ask God for things. Interrogatory prayer is when you ask God questions. And if you've never heard from God, try asking him a question. Try asking him this question: Lord, is there anything in my life that you don't like? But don't ask him this question if you don't want to hear the answer, because if you don't want to hear the answer, guaranteed you're going to. Josiah didn't achieve what he had hoped to achieve with his reforms, King Josiah. And we talked about King Josiah being influenced by Zephaniah last week. But he was killed at Megiddo in 608 BC. After Josiah came a very worldly, selfish, indulgent king called Jehoiakim. And the law became impotent. Justice became perverted, and there was bribery and corruption and lawlessness and oppression filled the streets of Jerusalem, God's city, until it wasn't safe to walk the streets alone. Violence filled the city, and this was supposed to be God's holy place. This was supposed to be God's city, and as I said last week, it was becoming worse than the people. God's people were becoming worse than the people that they ousted. Things were going from bad to worse, and Habakkuk was watching all this. He couldn't bear it, and so he came to God. Habakkuk had been complaining to God for up to 20 years in prayer. So this wasn't an instant thing. Habakkuk had been seeing this getting worse and worse and worse, and he's getting more and more frustrated. On the international scene, the Assyrians, who had by this time taken away the 10 tribes of Israel, were in decline. They were on the way out. So there was no strong power now. So Habakkuk knew that God wouldn't be able to bring Assyria to punish the Jews because they were declining in power, and there was no chance on the political scene. And it looked like nothing was happening while Jerusalem went down the drain. And Habakkuk said, God, how can you stand and do nothing about all this? In your holy city, the violence, the corruption, the fear is horrible, and you're doing nothing about it. God, why do you let me see these things? Why do you let me hear these things? He really let God have it and have an earful. And he says, you open my eyes, but shut my ears to hearing from you. And he really let God have an earful. He wanted God to reverse the trends and change society and restore law and order. And as is the one today, we still pray those prayers. We're still asking God to intervene in society. And, well, we'll see what happens later on. Habakkuk keeps asking God why. And why says, I don't understand what you're doing, and infers I could do a better job because I've got the right ideas, which is always a dangerous thing to do with God, asking why. Habakkuk said to God, why don't the bad people suffer? Why are you doing nothing? And God replies with 5 statements. Open your eyes a bit wider. You are not looking wide enough. Watch. Habakkuk was looking only at Jerusalem. He wasn't looking at the whole world. And this is what God is saying. He said, don't be consumed by what is going on in your immediate vicinity. Look on the bigger picture. And the second thing he says is, you're in for a big surprise. The third, I've planned something that will happen in your lifetime. Now, it's quite regular for things to happen in prophets' lifetimes, but here's God saying to Habakkuk, I've planned something that will happen in your lifetime. The fourth thing that he said, I haven't told you what I'm doing because you wouldn't believe it. And the fifth thing, I've already begun to do something and you've missed it. So what are you doing that I've missed and I haven't seen, says Habakkuk. God's reply was that he was raising up the Babylonians. Now, Babylon was just a little city on the side of the Tigris River. Nobody had ever heard of it, apart from one king, King Hezekiah, who, if you've ever read the Book of Kings, you'll know that Hezekiah was ill, and God said to him, okay, I'll give you another 10 years. And the king of Babylon sent him a get well card. Whether it was a card, whether it was a message, we don't know. But he sent him get well wishes. And King Hezekiah was so pleased with this get well wishes. He showed the emissaries all around his palace and his temple and everywhere. And he showed him all the jewels and gold and everything. And Isaiah said to King Hezekiah, Babylon will, hi Kath, Babylon will take away everything that you have showed those two men. From your palace, from your temple, from everywhere. So Isaiah saw what was coming. Babylon was growing and Hezekiah had not seen it. But shortly they would conquer Assyria and become the greatest power in the east. Babylon would become Jerusalem's greatest enemies. So much so that you would have Babylon versus Jerusalem in the book of Revelation, Babylon being the great prostitute and Jerusalem the pure bride, two women facing off against each other. And Babylon was derived its name from Babel, the Tower of Babel. And Babylon was going to become this great power, and Hezekiah had missed it. All you can see is what's happening in Jerusalem. Lift your eyes and look what's happening in the surrounding areas and in the world at large, said God. Lift your eyes up. Stop looking at your world. You're looking constantly at your tiny little world. Look at things on a bigger scale. There's a power rising in the east, and that's my instrument. My boiling over rage, my boiling over wrath against this city. This is how God deals with nations. He rises up another power, and you can see it again and again in history. And Habakkuk was shocked. Habakkuk changes his tune very quickly and says, "Whoa, now God, that's too much. That's far too much." Because already the Babylonians had a worse reputation as the Assyrians. The Assyrians used to impale people. They would literally sharpen off spikes, bury them in the ground, and then take a person by both legs and skewer them on it and just leave them to die. That was the Assyrians, which was horrific, and they had an amazingly bad reputation. But the Babylonians had a worse reputation. The Babylonians had a scorched earth policy, which meant that they would conquer a nation and literally remove every trace of life from the face of the earth. Even trees would be cut down. They would slaughter every animal. And when the Babylonians had passed by, nothing was left living. Habakkuk realized that if the Babylonians came to Jerusalem, there would be nothing left. This is the meaning of the statement where he talks about no fig tree, no grapes, no animals in the pens. There would be nothing left living. Then Habakkuk said, "That's too heavy a punishment, Lord." At first he's asking God, "Can you come and punish these people? Can you sort this out?" And then God says, "I am going to punish them. This is my punishment." And then Habakkuk goes, "Whoa! That punishment is really a little bit too heavy." Well, we don't get to pick and choose what God does. There are still some righteous people living in this city, including me, says Habakkuk. "I'm sorry, but I'm just not having that," says Habakkuk to God. Can you imagine talking this way to God? He's just like, nope, not having that. We got to sit down and we got to sort something else out. And this is the way that Habakkuk talks to God. You are using people who are more wicked than we are to punish us. That's immoral. That's when he said, "And you who are of purer eyes than to behold iniquity." That was the argument that Habakkuk used. Well, it's not actually true, because God looks on iniquity all the time. He used everything to twist God's arm into not bringing the Babylonians down on them. He's saying that God couldn't see the pure killed by the wicked. That was Habakkuk's argument. Habakkuk got thoroughly annoyed with God in the second part of it's you, it's Kath. Habakkuk got thoroughly annoyed with God in the second part of the argument. Why use worse people to punish the bad? Like Jonah, he went this time up to a watchtower. Jonah went up to a hill and watched. I can't remember who Jonah watched. I can't remember. It's one of those things with the stroke. Names go to my mind. But Jonah watched the people to see whether God reacted, and Habakuck went up to the watchtower and said, "I'm just going to watch to see what you do, see if you do it." And he's almost saying, "I dare you to bring them." And God said to Habakkuk, "You're doing no good sitting up there. Go down into the streets and write on the walls. Write these things on the walls so that the people passing can read them. You should be warning them, not sitting here just seeing what I do." When God reveals to us what he's going to do, he does so that we can warn other people and get ready. This is a good point, and the only reason why we should be reading and studying the book of Revelation is to get people ready, is to warn people and tell them what's coming. Not tell them in woe to you, but inform people. Tell people what the book of Revelation is about. It's about the end times. It's about what will happen if people don't come to God's way. And we should be warning people. Habakkuk gets down from his watchtower and goes down to the streets, and he writes it up on the walls. That's what he should have been doing all the time. Now, there are two translations of that verse. It's either "he who runs may read," or "he who reads may run." Either is relevant, and it could be either way in the Hebrew, but either way makes sense. Then God made this statement: "The just shall live by faith." Now, what does it mean? Habakkuk is saying the Babylonians will kill the righteous as well as the wicked. And God is saying, "No, I will protect the righteous. They will survive provided they remain faithful to me." That's the meaning of the just live by faith. The good people in Jerusalem will survive by keeping faith in me. When the Babylonians came, that would be a time when many might lose faith. They would just say, "Where's God? He's letting us down." But he said, the people who go on believing in me, who go on trusting in me, will survive that common judgment. So you don't need to worry. I'm just God. I'm a just God. And I promise you, Habakkuk, the good people will survive. And if they remain faithful to me, when the worst happens, I will protect them. I will protect the just, provided that they remain faithful to me. Faith in Greek means faithfulness. Faithfulness saves. It is to go on believing. It's to keep faith. That's what saves you, keeping faith. Not have faith once and you get your ticket to heaven, but remain faithful. And this is one of my bugbears with Christian faith today. We get people to make a commitment, but once they've made that commitment, on to the next one. if you get somebody to make a commitment, disciple them through to a stage where they're constantly going to believe, and they're going to believe faithfully forever. And even if it's a matter of you bring somebody to know Christ and you spend the rest of your life discipling them, then you've spent the rest of your life in a worthy pursuit, because we have got to get to grips with this and got to realize Christ talks about being faithful for until the end, not just being faithful at the beginning and then leave it all go to pot, but being faithful consistently. Even when the Babylonians come, even when the world caves in, even when everything goes wrong, I still trust him. And that's the essence of what Habakkuk is saying. Faith in marriage is to stay till death do you part. That's what faith is in marriage, to stick it out. There was an old couple being interviewed on their 70th wedding anniversary. And the interviewer asked, "Did you ever consider divorce?" And the old guy says, "Divorce? Never. Murder? Often." They had their differences, but they still stayed together. And then there's the faith like Moses had. When Moses prayed and his arms were held up by Aaron and Hur, he went on praying until the battle was won. Faith is believing in him whatever happens. It is keeping faith. Faith and faithfulness are exactly the same thing. The same word in Hebrew and in Greek. Therefore, when you read faith, you must read faithfulness as well. You cannot believe in Jesus unless you go on believing in him. Believing in him once isn't faith. Faith is going on believing in him whatever happens. It is keeping faith with the Lord that saves the righteous. Right up until the day of judgment, those who keep faith will be saved. The just shall live by keeping faith. Once saved, always saved is a common theme these days. I'm all wonky. Once saved, always saved is a common theme these days. And once again, you see here that is simply not true. We must keep faith. That's why it says in 3 out of the 4 Gospels, he who endures to the end will be saved. Habakkuk is told the people will survive the Babylonian judgment by keeping faith with me. And that verse is used in the New Testament by 3 different writers, and it always refers to continuing faithfully. Paul says in Romans 1:16, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who goes on believing, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from the first to the last, just as it is written, the righteousness will live by faith." In other words, it begins with faith and ends in faith. Hebrews 10 says, "We are not among those who shrink back and are lost in perdition, but we are among those who go on believing and are saved, and it is written, the just shall live by faith. Always, when this verse is quoted in the New Testament, the emphasis is about going on believing. Faith from beginning to end. This verse has been used to perpetuate the belief, once saved, always saved. But it clearly says you are saved by keeping on believing. The just shall live by going on believing. And if you are a believer in once saved, always saved, read Habakuck. Read the context within this verse, and then go to the Gospels and read them. Read Paul, read Hebrews, and it's a constant thing about going on believing. Paul talks to Timothy, I've run the race. And he's saying he's coming to the end, but he's stayed faithful all the way through the race. And that's how we get to God. So we look again at the breakdown of Habakkuk, a complaining prayer. God does too little. And then the question, why did people suffer? And the answer, the bad will suffer, the Babylonians will come, the good will survive, and judgment will come to the Babylonians. And then God does too much. Hi, Mike. And questions, why use worse to punish the bad? Why do the good people suffer? The answer is the good will survive and worse will suffer. God will deal with the Babylonians. Their turn will come. There is a series of woes in the second half of chapter 2. The word woe is a curse in biblical terms. Do you know that Jesus used the word woe as often as he said, "You're blessed. Blessed are the poor, woe to the rich. Blessed are those who mourn, woe to those who laugh now." Habakkuk says, woe to you Babylonians, your day will come. And if you remember, Jesus said woe to 3 out of the 4 cities around the Sea of Galilee. He said woe to Capernaum and the others, and he didn't say woe to Titus. And yet Titus is the only city that survives on that part of the sea. God will use you to punish us, says Habakkuk to the Babylonians, but woe to you. And he lists 5 things for which God will punish them. Injustice, stealing and plundering and looting. Imperialism, taking over dictatorship of other people. It's imperialism. Inhumanity, their bloodshed and their slave labour to build Babylon. Intemperance, they were drunks. They often had drunken orgies, and they cut down trees and slaughtered animals. When Israel went to war, God forbade them to cut down a single tree unless it was needed for the war. He said, you don't have a fight with the trees, they belong to me, which is a really interesting statement. whenever I read that statement, I think about the Ents in Lord of the Rings. I don't know why, I just do. But there we are. God said the trees belong to me. So be careful. Be nice to trees. And the fifth one was their idolatry, their worship of idols made of lifeless stone and wood and metal. They were idol worshippers. Habakkuk announced the doom of Babylon even before she had raised to power. So here's Habakkuk announcing doom and gloom for Babylon before she's even raised to power, before Babylon has even got to the heights of its power. And Habakkuk is already professing her doom. And that's how God answered his argument. The good will survive and the worse will suffer. Then comes the phrase, let all the earth keep silent before God. This is God quite impolitely telling Habakkuk, shut up. When he shut up and he saw the light. And that's what changed him. Habakkuk shut up and saw the light of God's word. And he was quiet and he thought about what God had said, and his whole mood changed. He had begun to sing as a result of his meditation. And it's an amazing song which he composed in his own mind and with his own hand. And he gave musical instructions. Shigionath, it's got to be sung with stringed instruments. Sorry about this. The whole change in his thinking, his argument, was based on a mind that was concentrated on the present, concentrated on what he could see immediately in front of him. But now he looked back into the past and he saw that God always intervenes, and he looked forward into the future and he saw that God will intervene again. And I'm prepared to wait. Now I'm going to do something that I don't normally do in these sessions. I'm going to read chapter 3 of Habakkuk. And it's a fantastic prayer. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet on Shigionath, which means on to be played on musical instruments, on stringed instruments. Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, Lord. Repeat them in our day, and in our time make them known. In wrath remember mercy. God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and his praise filled the earth. His splendour was like the sunrise. Rays flashed from his hands where his power was hidden. Plague went before him. Pestilence followed his steps. He stood and shook the earth. He looked and made nations tremble. The ancient mountains crumbled and the age-old hills collapsed. But he marched on forever. I saw the tents of Cushan in distress, at the dwelling of Midian in anguish. Where were you angry with the rivers, Lord? Was your wrath against the streams? Did you rage against the sea when you rode your horse and your chariot to victory? You uncovered your bow, you called for many arrows, you split the earth with rivers, the mountains saw you and writhed. Torrents of water swept by, the deep roared and lifted its waves on high. Sun and moon stood still in the heavens at the glint of your flying arrows, at the lightning of your flashing spear. In wrath you stood through the earth, and in anger you threshed the nations. You came out to deliver your people, to save your anointed one. You crushed the leader of the land of the wickedness. You stripped him from head to foot. With one spear you pierced his head when his warriors stormed out to scatter us, gloating as though about to devour the wretched who were in hiding. You trampled the sea with your horses, churned the great waters. I heard and my heart pounded, my lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones and my legs trembled. Yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come to the nations invading us. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vine, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pens and no cattle in the stall, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Saviour. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights. From the director of music on my stringed instruments. That was the measure of Habakkuk. And he was in love with God. And he was going to wait to see what God will do. He began by arguing with God, wrestling with God. And now he's at peace, and he's going to wait to see what God will do. Well, that's the end of our coverage of Habakkuk. Next time, I can't remember who's next. I will tell you now. Sorry. Haggai. We've got Haggai, Zechariah and Malachi to finish off the 12 minor prophets. And Haggai is an incredible book. And we'll move on to Haggai next. There are good stuff, Steve. Anthony, thank you. In between Habakkuk and Haggai, there is Jeremiah and Ezekiel, but they're not classed as minor prophets. They're major prophets, and they're called major and minor prophets, not because they were any more important, but Nineveh. That's it, John. Well done. But they were classed as minor prophets because the books were shorter, and the major prophets were Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel, and we'll maybe cover those once I've finished on the minor prophets. But we'll jump from Habakkuk over Jeremiah and Ezekiel to Haggai, and so Haggai will be next. God bless you. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next week. Goodbye.